Hi everyone, this is Dana. I wanted to go ahead and give you this lecture for Module 1 in this class. Really just an introduction to nonprofits, and I want to give you a general overview of what a nonprofit is. There's a lot of confusion about what is a nonprofit, what is not a nonprofit, and what do you even call nonprofits. So I want to take you through this, and I do have a slideshow. It is not fancy because I put it together quite recently. So, um, there we go. Let's go ahead and get started. The class is 1293, Intro to Nonprofits, and I want to talk to you about what is a nonprofit organization. So we are going to talk about three main things. We're going to define what a nonprofit is. We're going to talk about the role that nonprofit organizations have in today's society, and then we're going to, I'm going to give you a short history of nonprofits. We're not going to get into the weeds and go into just a super lot of detail on any of these because this class is an introduction to nonprofit organizations. So the information, the thing I really want you to remember is that all of the information I'm going to share with you, there are usually exceptions. So when I say nonprofits have to do A, B, and C, there might be exceptions to that. Very seldom is anything written in stone. So just remember that. The things that I'm showing you and talking about in this course are what is typical. And so if you find out from somebody that they have a model that looks a little differently, don't just charge in there going, well, I took Intro to Nonprofits and I know you're wrong, because sometimes there are exceptions to the rules. So what's in a name? First of all, there's a lot of confusion a lot of times about nonprofit organizations. What are they called? Well, there's lots of names in the United States and around the world. You might be familiar with terms like a non-governmental organization, NGO, especially overseas. Outside of the United States, they are quite frequently called NGOs, non-governmental organization. Sometimes it's referred to as the voluntary sector, not-for-profit, a 501c3, a charity or charitable organization, a philanthropy or a philanthropic organization, the third sector, or just some other term. For our purposes for this course, we are just going to call them all nonprofit organizations or nonprofits. Sometimes I might refer to it as a 501c3. It's really, that just means the same thing as a nonprofit. The term, the third sector, is something I want to talk with you just a little bit about because it provides a context of how nonprofits operate in our society. So that really helps you define what a nonprofit is. So let's talk a little bit about that. So if it's the third sector, then you know that there are at least three sectors. So the first sector could be government, and that is, pretty, hopefully, easy to define. Governments might be federal, state, regional, all of those. Businesses, those are the private businesses. We'll define these a little bit more. And then the nonprofit, the third sector, intends to fill the gap of needs between business and government. So that's really why they're called the third sector. They're just sort of in there. They're not government, they're not business, they're in the middle. So let's talk first about the business sector, okay? McDonald's, Apple, Meta, Amazon, your local grocery store, your gas station you go to, we interact with for-profit businesses every single day, sort of like where I bought my coffee today, because I need that. They exist to provide a product or service. They earn a profit that goes back to its owners or shareholders, sole proprietors, partnerships, privately held corporations like a small, family-owned restaurant, or they could be publicly traded huge corporations like Amazon. So the government sector. These could be federal, regional, state, county, local government. They could also be tribal governments, which sort of fit into a whole different category. So this could include schools, health departments, parks, or regulatory organizations like the Federal Aviation Administration. They're primarily, almost entirely funded by taxes and tax revenue, And these entities essentially belong to every citizen. They exist to, oh, let me get to here. Yeah. They exist to ensure that our government and our society fulfills their responsibilities to the population, to the general welfare. They're, of the people, by the people, and for the people. So now let's talk about the nonprofit sector, the third sector. Nonprofit organizations are like all of these. United Way, for example, is the largest one in the United States. The YMCA is another large one. American Red Cross is a large one. OSU is a nonprofit organization. Churches are nonprofit organizations. Nonprofit organizations often fill the gap between government and businesses. They are created when caring people recognize there's a need in society that isn't being met by either the business or government. They are not just a volunteer group. They're a formal organization. So I'm going to give you our formal definition in just a minute, but first I want you to understand how ubiquitous nonprofit organizations are in American life. And by ubiquitous, I mean they're literally everywhere. You cannot do anything without running into a nonprofit business. So let's just talk about yesterday. I woke up it was a Sunday. I woke up because I had my two dogs jumped up on my bed and they were hungry. My two dogs were rescued from an animal shelter. So I got dressed. I took care of the dogs. Then I got dressed, and while I got dressed, I listened to National Public Radio. Then my son walked in and said he needed a ride up to school because he had a lab assignment that was due. So I drove him up to the University of Tulsa. Then I went to church, and after church, I jumped online for my daughter's soccer booster club and took care of some business and ordered some things that I needed to do for that. So before noon or 12:30 on a Sunday, nonprofit organizations had already impacted my life several different times, right? An animal rescue organization is a nonprofit. The radio station is a nonprofit. My son's college is a nonprofit. The church is a nonprofit. The booster club is a nonprofit. So literally nonprofit organizations are everywhere. But it is important to remember a nonprofit isn't just a collection of people doing nice things. They are a legal entity. So let's go ahead. We're going to have the official definition now. And I do want to give you this caveat. There are lots of different definitions of nonprofit organizations. There are legal definitions by the IRS, Internal Revenue Service. There are other government agencies that have definitions of nonprofits, both state and federal. But for our purposes for this course, we are going to define nonprofits this way. Nonprofit organizations are those organizations that have these 6 characteristics. 1, their purpose provides a societal benefit. 2, they are formally organized. So there's a formal organization to them. Number 3, they are non-governmental. 4, any net revenue that they have, in other words, profits, they don't go back to owners because there aren't really owners, but they are reinvested into the organization's work. 5, they are self-governing, usually through a board of directors. And 6, they are answerable to the public. And there are reasons for that that we'll kind of talk about a little bit here in a little while. So who owns a nonprofit? This is a tough one. I would say even people who work in the nonprofit arena get confused by this. Some people think that nonprofits are owned by the executive director or the founder or the employees. Some people think they're owned by the clients that they serve, or by the board of directors or the trustees or the government, the IRS. And honestly, all of those people are partially correct because nonprofit organizations are technically owned by the public, which has said everyone, you and I and everyone else, owns nonprofits. They are owned by society. That said, it really is the board of directors who are responsible for the nonprofit. The board hires a director, an executive director, a CEO, whoever it is, who is responsible for overseeing all of the daily operations of the organization. So, next question. Why are nonprofit organizations tax exempt? Well, they don't pay taxes the way individuals or businesses do because nonprofits exist solely to provide benefits to society, like what we talked about in the definition. So the government is willing to exempt those organizations from taxes. Why? Because they want to encourage organizations that fill gaps, that encourage volunteerism, and that make the world a safer and better place. So now you may have noticed that I said exempt from some taxes. There are times when a nonprofit does have to pay some taxes. I am not going to dive in deeply into those situations because they are really complex and you just don't need to know them at the introductory level. Just remember that, again, like I said at the beginning, everything that I tell you, these are just generalizations. They're not always true across the board. So the next question that I want to cover is, we know that nonprofits are tax exempt, but when you donate to a nonprofit organization, a lot of times you're able to take that money off of your own taxes that you pay. So why is that? Well, when individuals donate to nonprofits, they can deduct those quite often from their taxes. And that is because the government wants to encourage people to support nonprofits, because nonprofits, like what we just talked about, they fill that gap that the government isn't necessarily filling. So it's in everyone's best interest, yours, mine, your next door neighbor, everyone's best interest to keep nonprofits working. And so really you can kind of look at it as when you make a donation to a nonprofit, it's sort of like you're taking your money that should have been tax money and you're directing it to something that you feel connected to or that is important to you. So in a way, it's sort of like you get to just direct your tax money to what's important to you, and it gives you some control, and that's kind of cool. Now, are there different types of nonprofit organizations? Absolutely. There are literally dozens of different types of nonprofits, and each one of them has to follow different rules. Who decides what type of nonprofit organization you are? Well, the IRS, because they are the ones who give you your nonprofit status. They get to decide what a nonprofit organization is, and it's based on this whole host of rules that are very complex, and I do not expect you to learn them all. So I want to keep it as simple as possible, at least here in the beginning, and go over the different types of nonprofit organizations. So the main one that you're going to hear, and a lot of times people think that all nonprofits are 501c3s. They're not, but if you say a 501c3, you know that it is a nonprofit. And there are two main types of 501c3s. There is a public charity. These are most of the nonprofits that you can name off the top of your head are going to fall into that category. They operate exclusively for religious, charitable, scientific, literary, or educational purposes. And that is something literally from the IRS website. They provide services that otherwise the government might have to provide. Then you have the second type, which are private foundations. You have probably heard of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or the Ford Foundation, or the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. You know, they're practically household names, right? So those are all nonprofit foundations. They have to follow some different rules as far as who, who funds them and how much money they have to give away every year. But for our purposes, just remember that nonprofit foundations exist to give money away to nonprofit organizations. Now, it is vital that you know this. You'll see there on the slide that I put the default 501c3. You really need to know this because a lot of people who start nonprofits do not understand this, and they mess things up at the very beginning. If you file for a nonprofit status with the Internal Revenue Service, they will assume you are setting up a foundation, a private foundation, unless you can prove that you're a public charity. So I'm not going to go into all of the details here, but essentially you need to know that the private foundation is the default, and that in order to prove you're a public charity, you have to show that you have lots of different types of support from lots of different sources, and that makes you a public charity. All right, let's talk about some of the other 501c nonprofits. And like I said, there are dozens of these. There's a 501c1, and those are nonprofits that are set up through acts of Congress, specifically credit unions and farm loan associations. I think actually the Red Cross of the United States also falls under that category because it was set up by an act of Congress. There's 501c4, which are civic leagues, social welfare, employee associations. Then there's 501c5, which are labor and agricultural organizations. 501c6 are business leagues. If you've ever been familiar with a chamber of commerce, those are 501c6s. 501c7 are social and recreational clubs, sort of like my daughter's soccer booster club. 501c10 are fraternal organizations, so the Masons or the Lions, or a college fraternity or sorority that would fall under those. There are lots and lots of different designations. So if you're really interested in doing a deep dive on how many there are, go ahead and go. You can go to Wikipedia. They have a really good table that shows all of the different types of nonprofits and what they are. I think it's really interesting, and you feel free to just jump on there. Not required for the class, but jump on there if you're interested. So just keep in mind there are lots of different nonprofits. All right, so now let's talk a bit about the history of nonprofit organizations. Service to others is something that's built into our human DNA. We are by nature social animals. So, they know, archaeologists and anthropologists know from prehistoric data and from finding fossils and so forth, that there came a day when in our societal evolution that some caveman named, Ugtuk, broke his leg. And whereas before the tribe that he was with would just let him die or maybe even kill him out of mercy, because if you break your leg, there's nothing you can do. So there was a point where human society stopped killing people who broke their legs and started taking care of them. So, so when Ugtuk broke his leg, all of the other members of the tribe said, you know what, we're still going to take care of him, and we will all give a little bit of our own resources to support him because we still think he's valuable. And if you had to point to the beginning of nonprofit charity, that's probably really where that started. And of course, our societies evolved even more after that. The ancient Egyptians actually set up nonprofit or charitable organizations. The Romans, all of the ancient civilizations, the Mayans, all of that, those prehistoric societies, they really did have charities, and they worked to protect the general welfare of their society. Then, as we entered the Middle Ages, a lot of times the church was a big part of charity, and the church actually took care of people in need. There were times when people were literally required to pay taxes to both the government and to the church. And that's because the church was taking care of the general population. So let's talk a bit, though, about the United States and how things started. Nonprofit organizations started almost immediately after the Revolutionary War. So Ben Franklin started some nonprofits, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton. Okay, yeah, I just couldn't help it. I had to put Hamilton in there. And a lot of the other founding fathers, they built institutions that still exist today. Libraries, universities, orphanages, all types of different charitable organizations. But honestly, it wasn't just, well, like I like to call the rich white dudes who made a difference. Lots of other organizations, lots of other people did create these organizations. They were not usually quite as formalized. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s is really when you saw more of the role of women taking leadership in creating these. So we had Clara Barton after the Civil War. She started the Red Cross. Juliette Lowe, who looks really frightening there, she started the Girl Scouts. These were in the late 1800s. So honestly, men and women of color often had restrictions placed on them that made it really hard to formalize those charitable activities. But by the early 1900s, there were some nonprofits that were dedicated to meeting the needs of people who were historically marginalized. So the NAACP began in the early 1900s and other similar organizations. But it was also in the late 1800s and the early 1900s that the government started collecting income taxes. Yeah, did you know we didn't even have income taxes when we first started for like the first 100 and something years of the United States? But when the U.S. started collecting income taxes, then of course people immediately wanted to find ways to reduce their taxes. So the government allowed people to get tax advantages if they donated to charity. Now, obviously, this mostly benefited, as it does today, the super rich people. But this was the point in American history where we just saw an explosion of nonprofit organizations. The Carnegie Library, Carnegie Hall in New York. Obviously, the Carnegies had a lot of money. The Rockefeller Center. Universities all over. So many universities started in the late 1800s and early 1900s, including OSU. And a lot of that, especially the private universities, were because of wealthy people who were looking for a way to not pay so many taxes, and they started these as nonprofits. So toward the end of the 20th century, so we're talking about the 80s and 90s, the government really started providing more funding to nonprofit sector. And in the 90s, during George Bush the first, during his presidency, they passed some laws so that the federal government could even give money to some religious organizations, which had never been done before. And so there was another huge spike during that time on the number of nonprofit organizations in the United States. Literally, that has doubled, tripled, quadrupled since the early 1980s. It has just, the number of nonprofit organizations that have been created far exceed the number of private organizations that are started or government programs that are started. And I love Madonna because I came of age in the 80s, and I attended college in the 80s and 90s. I was in the public relations. That was my major. You could not take a class on nonprofit. You couldn't take a class on how to do fundraising. I actually, my nonprofit, I'm sorry, say that again. My public relations classes, we would have maybe 1 week or one chapter on fundraising because fundraising was considered part of public relations. Well, now we know today, flash forward to 2022, and you can take classes at almost every college on nonprofit management, fundraising. Literally, those classes and those disciplines and those departments did not exist 30 years ago. that is how big a role nonprofits are now playing in our daily lives. And I think that's it. So that is the end. What we did talk about, just to reiterate, we talked about what we defined what a nonprofit organization is. We have talked about the role that nonprofit organizations play in our country and our society, and we talked about the history of nonprofit organizations. And that's the stuff that I want you to know. I'm going to have some assignments where you do a little bit more work and do a little bit more research, but I hope it's fun. I hope that it's interesting to you. So please do give me feedback. Let me know if there's something you didn't understand or that just wasn't clear. Like I said, this is my first time teaching the class, so your feedback is so important. I do appreciate it, and I will talk to you again soon. All right?